and welcome to this session that looks at governance innovation on public participation and engagement, learning from citizens' assemblies. Well, we find ourselves at the end of the first week of COP27, and 7 years ago, a broad coalition of citizens, activists, scientists, also climate diplomats and world leaders adopted the Paris Agreement. And it's fair to say we have come a long way in those 7 years, but the country's national plans to address climate change and the pledges under the Paris Agreement are still falling short of the ambition we need, as we all well know. Despite the call in Glasgow last year for countries to up their ambition, according to the United Nations Emission Gap Report, since COP26, since last year, the new pledges submitted only take 1% of projected global emissions out of the atmosphere, which is really insufficient progress. And most G20 members would actually will be falling short of their promises for emission reductions for 2030. So we need to do much better if we are able to actually keep temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And the issue is that in many countries where ambition is still lagging, what we lack is political will and public support for climate action. And political will and public support are ultimately the fuel of net zero transition. And so in order for citizens to support climate action, climate policies need to be fair, but they also need to be developed with effective and meaningful citizens' engagement. And the growing trend of citizens' assemblies around the world is a very promising development in this area. Just so that we're all on the same page, what are actually climate assemblies? Climate assemblies use randomly selected citizens, or what sometimes we call everyday people, non-climate experts, not politicians. They select people to learn about climate change, deliberate, and make recommendations on different aspects of climate crisis. And the way they are selected is through so-called sortition process or lottery, which looks to select citizens that represent the average makeup of the country or a region or a city, depending on where the assembly is taking place. So one seeks to ensure there is a diversity of age groups, social and economic backgrounds, education, and also attitudes and political preferences in some cases towards climate change. And climate assemblies aim to bring this wisdom of citizens, of everyday people, to climate action. However, to meet the purpose and to be impactful, climate assemblies need to be done well. And this is why last year, with the support of the European Climate Foundation, a knowledge network on climate assemblies, CNOCA, has been established. And I'm very happy to welcome you to this discussion today on behalf of CNOCA's Management Committee and on behalf of the Grantham Research Institute. And in 1 year, we have managed to gather over 500 members to the network and gather a lot of knowledge on how assemblies have been doing so far and insights on how they can be more impactful and more effective. And I'm very pleased to say we have a fantastic panel today of experts, many of whom are members of CNOCA, representing expertise from all around the world, among the conveners of the assemblies, organizers, and also participants from the assemblies ranging from national, regional, and global level. So I'm very pleased to open this discussion, and our first panelist is Susie Tonnant. Susie has been an engine and advocate for climate assemblies and has a wealth of knowledge. She was the head of the Secretariat of Scotland's Climate Assembly in 2020 and 21 at the Government of Scotland. So Susie, my first question to you is, you headed the Secretariat for the Scottish Climate Assembly. What was the main rationale for the government to hold the assembly? What was your ambition? And what was the main value you think of the assembly? And has anything surprised you about the outcomes of it?
Thank you very much, Alina, and thank you very much for the warm welcome. Quite a lot of questions in that, so I'll unpack it a little as we go through. In terms of the rationale, Scotland has quite a participatory approach to policy making. We have a legal requirement to have a public engagement strategy on climate change, and we have an interest in participatory budget making. So it was going really with the grain of the way we tend to work in Scotland, but the main rationale was that we believed it would lead to more legitimate, robust and effective policy. You mentioned ambition, and our 2019 Climate Change Act set up the Assembly, but it also set some statutory emissions reductions targets, which are pretty challenging. It's a 75% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2045. And it was really clear to us as policymakers that to achieve this level of ambition, every aspect of people's lives and the structure of society would be affected. And therefore, it was only right and actually only effective if decisions of this scale are reached with people rather than legislated by policymakers in isolation. As a policymaker, it's really useful to test the appetite for change and also what trade-offs people prefer. For something like climate change, there are so many ways that you could address the issue, and understanding where people would put priority is really important, because people bring their own insights from their own lived experience, and then they go through the process of learning and deliberation before they make recommendations. That means those recommendations are robust and appropriate. Policymakers can have quite a narrow perspective, but an assembly, because it's so much more diverse, will take perhaps quite a different view and a more considered view. So, for example, the impact of a transport policy on people with mobility issues will be more thoughtful if someone in the room with you as you're making the policy says, that's a great idea, but this is how we need to do it for it to work for someone like me. You asked about the value of an assembly, and in a nutshell, for me, it's a mandate for action. In Scotland's Climate Assembly, the members produced 81 recommendations and a statement of ambition. And this really is a roadmap of policies with ordinary citizens setting out a concrete programme. So a goldmine for policymakers. It has policies that are legitimate and robust and effective because of the process that they went through to generate those recommendations, and because of the type of people that propose them. As you said, you know, they're representative in our case of Scotland. And I'm confident that the policies that the members proposed will be reflected in the next climate change plan, which is the way Scotland sets out how it will meet its climate targets over a defined time period. And the next plan is due to be produced at the end of the year. And I've been assured by those who are involved in drafting that plan that the recommendations of the Assembly members are absolutely going to feed through into that. You asked if we had been surprised about process. We took quite an innovative approach by involving children and young people through a collaboration with Children's Parliament. So we had people that were aged 8 to 14 involved with that process. And I was surprised how over the course of the Assembly, the adults really embraced that aspect of cross-generational dialogue and became advocates for the children's recommendations. And the other thing that surprised me about process was that we held our assembly online during the pandemic. And I was really struck by the level of engagement and the quality of discussions that we had, despite being online, which I think initially people had been slightly skeptical about. I think now we know that it absolutely can be done, as we're doing right now. In terms of outcomes, a strong theme was really a desire for information to be available to everyone. So not just children or people who had been through a citizens' assembly process, and not just about climate change, but also about the climate impact of actions or services. So for example, asking for carbon labelling on goods so that people can make informed choices. And that was a really strong theme, that people said, if only we knew, then we could behave differently. And so they wanted everybody to have that knowledge that they had gained. And the final thing that I would say on that was in terms of democratic engagement. I think often in Western democracies, there can be a lot of polarization and cynicism in political debate, and giving citizens this leadership role in setting a policy agenda really helps to counteract this. And at an individual level, we know of at least one Assembly member who was inspired to get involved in local politics after being in the Assembly and has stood for political office in her community. So I hope that covers all the bits of the question that you answered, but basically, yeah, really kind of inspiring process that really puts people, ordinary people, at the heart of decision making and gives a mandate to government to act.
Thank you so much, Susie, and particularly for sharing this cross-generational dialogue aspect, which I know Tilly will build upon in her remarks as well. But just very quickly, what advice would you give to governments and maybe civil society organizations which are thinking of hosting or organizing a climate assembly?
Well, the first thing I say would really encourage people to engage with it. I think it has been a really fantastic process for us in Scotland, and I would encourage people around the world to consider it. Be really clear about what you want the Assembly to achieve. We already had an act, a Climate Change Act, and emissions targets, and we had a policy about poverty reduction. So what we wanted to know was, how should we do it? How should Scotland change? What measures should we put in place? And so be really clear about what you're asking members to advise you about. Then I think you need a really structured process to embed the outcomes in policy making. So in our case, the Assembly Members' report was laid in Parliament, and ministers were required in the legislation to respond within 6 months. And we engaged with parliamentary committees and set up meetings with 17 different Scottish Government ministers and the Assembly members so they could have a direct interaction. And we also spoke to civil servants as well. So it was really important to design from the outset how the recommendations that came out of the Assembly would be embedded in the policy making process. And finally, I would say make sure that you have resource, not just to support the delivery of the Assembly itself, which I think is the first thing that people think about, but also when the Assembly makes recommendations, how are you going to implement those recommendations and what resource are you going to have available to do that, to take it forward?
Thank you so much, Susie. That's great advice. And with that, I'm going to go to our next panelist, who is Tilly Pegg. Tilly is a democracy artist at the Green Tiger Foundation, which is a collaboration platform for sustainable Estonia. And Tilly has been organizing climate assemblies in Estonia on different environmental challenges of today to enrich decision-making. So Tilly, what was the motivation for the Estonia's climate assembly? And particularly interested, why did you choose to focus on young people and also on just transition? And if you can also share what was the impact in your opinion. Thank you, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello from Estonia, northeast of Europe. I'm democracy innovator, yeah, and to specify, we've organized 2 climate assemblies in Estonia so far. So the regional one that I'm going to talk, and a local one with one city government. And we are in the process of kicking off more and more, because this is our way of basically achieving the societal change and enriching democracy and the way we do decisions. But then about the youth climate assembly, shortly, I try. A year ago, we initiated a climate assembly in the oil shale region of Estonia. So that's next to Russia. And it was specifically with young people between the ages of 16 and 29. And the just transition process was going on and still going on in Estonia. And at that time, the Just Transition National Plan was on public display, public consultation. So, but the youth, the young people from the region, because they were not organized at all, and they were not involved in the process, like totally left out, we, in a way, offered this climate assembly as a great engagement format, but also kind of empowerment format to the responsible ministry. And it was a success. Like, we launched it, we organized it together. So it was virtual, because it was the COVID was very harsh a year ago. for 4 days. It was bilingual, so simultaneously in Estonian and in Russian, because in the region there are in total 144,000 inhabitants, but that's mainly Russian speaking, the region. So we had to have 2 languages. And we had 33 randomly selected, but then representative participants between this 16 and 29. If these young people would have been called to a very kind of regular and traditional consultation process, they would first not have showed up, I would believe. They would not have had the kind of skills to actually participate or to understand, like, where are we invited to? And there would have been mainly maybe individual opinions instead of kind of common consensus. And this is what I love about climate assemblies. I'm a dedicated fan because that format gives the participants skills to contribute to policy making, skills to discuss, to express your opinion, to also be on like debate, supplies with scientific expertise and knowledge on the topic. So you have the learning, and it guides the participants through a very carefully designed process that is kind of a safe haven for different opinions, but also for creating the common understandings. So instead, now we have in the region young people that are equal members. They have been invited to the Just Transition Steering Committee. So they are equal members and representing the voice of youth next to the industry, next to the trade unions, next to the local governments. They were missing there before, but they are there now, thanks to the Climate Assembly. So this was the kind of empowering part. Then these young people, many of them, actually I have the background picture. So these are the Climate Assembly representatives together with our president there. So the president also met with them. They formed a separate civic organization to actually raise climate awareness in the region and also raise collaboration skills, because this is a huge problem, not only in that region, but in Estonia in general. And of course, also the recommendation from the Climate Assembly, they in great deal were also accepted to the Just Transition Plan. But that was like, for us as the organizers of the Climate Assembly, the recommendations, of course, are the kind of focus, but we achieved so much more than we ever hoped with that one process. So it was a win-win situation for the ministry, who is responsible for the Just Transition process, because they wanted to get young people involved, but so that they would also be kind of inspired, you know, with some kind of new formats. It was a win-win for us because we continue kicking off organizing climate assemblies and also consulting the public sector in how they can institutionalize them themselves, the format, because we show that, yes, there are results. You see, young people weren't active before. They are, a bunch of people is now, and they gather more and more people all the time. Their voice is represented in this very official process of Just Transition. And so, yeah, it's a success story, I would say.
Thank you, Tilly. Very inspiring experience, and particularly interesting how young people have been effectively engaged in this process of designing a Just Transition Plan. I think this is very high on the agenda, of course, at this COP as well. So definitely an experience hopefully many countries can learn from. I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage our participants to post some questions. I hope we will have some time at the end to engage with the audience. But for now, I'm going to our next speaker, who is Claire Milieu. Claire is a Global Assembly co-founder. So she was one of the people who had a brilliant idea to hold the Climate Assembly at the global level. And she is also Knowledge Circle lead at the ISV Foundation. So Claire, what was the purpose of the Global Assembly? Obviously very ambitious undertaking. And what have you learned, how public engagement can advance, public participation can advance climate action, and particularly at the global level? Over to you.
Thank you, Alina. Well, the Global Assembly for COP26 was the first time we tried to create deliberation, transnational deliberation at the global level. And so back in 2020, the idea emerged, and it was initiated by civil society with the support from institutions, including Antonio Guterres himself. And what was done was a process of deliberation online, bringing together 100 assembly members from across the world, using sortition, civic lottery, as the mechanism for identifying the location and then the assembly members. And Guillaume, who is on this call, I know he's struggling a little bit with the connection, and will speak in a moment about his own experience of being an assembly member. But what's I think quite important to say is that the makeup of the assembly was quite revealing of the diversity of the global population. 50% of the assembly members were women, 70% were living under $10 a day, which is the average, figure at the global level. And then we follow the population density, and for instance, we had 17 assembly members from India and 18 from China. So the idea was to try to show that deliberation was possible. So it was very much a prototyping year, and we have learned a lot, and we've got a team of 30 researchers who are currently evaluating the process, and their evaluation will be available soon. And we're about to launch next week the report for the Global Assembly with all our learning, and I hope people can take that on board. I would say in terms of the many learnings we're making at the moment is reflecting on how these processes are not neutral. And the word we've used with the Global Assembly is integrity, because I think it's important to remember that deliberation is very much rooted in Western principles of Western democracy, and a lot of the assemblies that have been done have been delivered in the global North with a lot of assumptions, I would say, and myself, as white person, privileged white person from the global North, with the best intention. I think what we need to acknowledge is that we bring our cultural values and beliefs into the process we design. And so that's one of probably the most fundamental learning for the Global Assembly is how do you design processes that are truly grounded in decolonization and depatriarchalization and all of this. And I think we've got a responsibility to make sure that the processes we design are really suited for people in circumstances that, for instance, in this instance, Guillaume is joining us from the Democratic of Congo, and there are issues with connection at the moment, and how do you make these processes really inclusive from multiple perspectives? So we'll hear from Guillaume in a minute, but I don't want to take too much of his time.
Thank you so much, Claire. That's fascinating, and thank you in particular for raising the importance, as we think, in particular beyond kind of European domain, of ensuring equality and accessibility of participation. So very, very interesting insights. I hope we can pick up on that in the discussion later on. But is Guillaume with us still? I just saw him dropping. Yeah, it looks like his connection is struggling. So perhaps until we get Guillaume back, online from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm going to go to Dermot. Dermot Turney is an associate professor at the Dublin City University. And Dermot has been involved in a number of citizens' assemblies, not just on climate in Ireland, not just on climate change, but also on biodiversity, which is currently happening, and has been an expert witness to those assemblies, but also has written academically on the topic. So Dermot, first of all, I was wondering if you could share with us the experience from the Irish Climate Assembly. This was one of the earlier ones and quite a different setup from others. So could you tell us a little bit about the experiences and the impacts of the Assembly in Ireland?
Sure, thanks, Alina, and thanks for the invitation to participate. It's been a really interesting discussion so far. So I guess the first thing to say about Ireland, and greetings from the very western edge of Europe. We heard from Tile earlier on from the other side of Europe, and we're hearing from elsewhere around the world as well. The one thing to say about Ireland from the outset is that we, when the decision was taken to run a climate assembly, it was building on a longer tradition of citizens' assemblies in Ireland, going back now about a decade. So we have had a number of different citizens' assemblies on a multitude of different topics. First of all, run by academics, funded by philanthropy, and then as a kind of proof of concept. And then from 2012 onwards, there have been a number of government-sponsored but independently run citizens' assemblies. The one in which climate change was considered, it was almost an accident that climate change was included on the agenda. Because the Citizens' Assembly that considered climate change ran from 2016 to 2018. The biggest topic that it focused on, both in terms of public profile and time, weekends devoted to the topic, was the question of Ireland's then constitutional ban on abortion. And so it was into that Citizens' Assembly that the topic of climate change was inserted. And it was only inserted as a result of an amendment as the resolution was passing through Parliament to add climate change to the agenda, an amendment from the Green Party. So one thing to say is that it almost didn't happen at all. But from that inauspicious start, it really gained momentum. So the Citizens' Assembly deliberated over 2 weekends on the topic of climate change in the autumn of 2017. It consisted of 99 randomly selected members of the public, along similar lines to some of the other models we have heard about, selected through a sortition process. And it came up with a series of ambitious recommendations on climate change at the end of the second weekend, which came as a surprise to me, the recommendations, and they came as a surprise to policymakers and observers. And in common with experience in other jurisdictions, they showed that our conventional wisdom about public views on climate change, when the public are exposed to relevant expert information, is much more ambitious than our expectations would suggest. One other thing to note about the Irish case is that it happened 5 years ago. So remember the context. This was nobody had heard of Greta Thunberg. There were no school strikes. That global kind of momentum around climate action had yet to kick off, certainly here in Ireland, but I think it's fair to say in many other countries as well. So the context in which the Climate Assembly took place in Ireland was quite different. And the other thing to note about the Irish experience is that now it is now 5 years ago, so we have the benefit of time and hindsight. We can see what happened because a significant, half a decade has passed since the Assembly met on climate change. And what we can see from the record is that not all of the recommendations were accepted. One or two were. So one controversial recommendation was not accepted, and that was around the treatment of agriculture emissions from agriculture, which is a politically sensitive topic in Ireland. But many of the recommendations were, and two important recommendations that have been followed up and acted upon were a recommendation that climate change should be placed at the center of policymaking. And that found expression in the amendment of Ireland's then framework climate law, which was a very weak piece of legislation. It has been strengthened through an amending piece of legislation that was enacted last year, passed into law in the middle of 2021. So these things take time. It took 4 years for that process of fully implementing that key recommendation from the Citizens' Assembly to fully pass through. Another interesting recommendation was around Ireland's carbon tax. So we had a carbon tax, but it had remained at a relatively low level for a long time. As a result of a recommendation from the Citizens' Assembly, the cross-party consensus was reached on a progressive increasing year by year of Ireland's carbon tax. And again, this is a topic that we would think ordinary citizens wouldn't like. Citizens, we were led to expect, don't like paying more taxes, and yet a very high proportion of the members of the Assembly voted for a higher level of carbon tax. So those are just a couple of instances of where the recommendations from the Citizens' Assembly have ended up 5 years down the line.
Thank you so much, Dermot. It's really interesting example and fascinating how the Assembly actually had a very tangible impact, as you say, on lawmaking in Ireland and also on the specific policies implemented. And we're also seeing, for example, in France, similar situation where a lot of recommendations that citizens made as part of the Citizens' Assembly get later legislated. But yet, oftentimes we hear critique from climate activists, and particularly that citizens' assemblies might delay climate action, and their impact perhaps could be improved. So my next question is to you, Dermot, but also to the rest of the panel. So we now have some time for discussion. How do you think we can make climate assemblies at different levels more impactful? So I'll start with Dermot, and then anyone else who wants to take the floor, please feel free. And for the participants, please post your questions in Q&A function so that we can address issues that are of interest to you. So Dermot, please.
Thanks, Selina. I might make 3 points in response to that question. In terms of how to make them more impactful. So one, and this very much ties to CNOCA, the network sponsoring this talk. One is around the value of experience and sharing experience. So I mentioned that here in Ireland, we have now around a decade of experience of Citizens' Assembly. So policymakers in the Irish context are quite familiar with this way. It's probably no longer even an innovation in Ireland. It's an embedded part of our decision-making process. And that's not to say that there aren't critics of the process, but it is something that policymakers that they know what it involves, they know what it looks like, they're relatively familiar with it. But I know in other national contexts that it might be something more out of the ordinary. So I think networks such as CNOCA that allow for sharing of experience between policymakers and other actors, stakeholders, civil society, who are more familiar with these types of processes and those who are less familiar but want to learn more. I think that's an important development and something that I know CNOCA is focusing on. The second observation I would make is around the institutions or the way we institutionalize follow-up. And I can say a little bit about what has happened here in Ireland. I know there are other models in other jurisdictions, and this isn't to say that what we have done in Ireland is by any means the only way to do it, but it's an example of kind of institutionalizing the follow-up process. So how it works in Ireland is that a special parliamentary committee is set up to consider the recommendations from a citizens' assembly, whatever topic it is. So there was one last year on gender equality. And that then meets, that happened with the Climate Assembly. It will happen with the ongoing Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss that Alina mentioned. And that meets for a number of months. It consists of members of Parliament, members of both houses of Parliament. And that really does two things. It allows for a further fleshing out and elaboration of the recommendations, but it also, it is similarly a deliberative setting. So, it is, it's not the cut and thrust of parliamentary, we have a very Westminster style of adversarial parliamentary politics here in Ireland. The parliamentary committees are a more considered, more deliberative space to tease out the recommendations for a citizens' assembly, and they infuse the recommendations that come out of the citizens' assembly with that representative democratic legitimacy. So it goes to the argument that who are these people? They weren't elected, the members of the assembly. So that's how things work in Ireland. It then gives the parliamentarians a stake in the outcomes. So as I said, that's just one model among many. But I think it's important from the outset to build in some understanding and some expectation of what that follow-up process will look like, rather than just plowing all these resources into running a climate assembly, and then you get to the end and you think, oh, what do we do now? So planning from the start, that piece around impact and legacy is important. And then the third and final observation to make, and this picks up on the remarks of Susie and Tile around the voice of young people. So my specific involvement in the ongoing Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss taking place here in Ireland is that I was involved in running a children and young people's assembly on biodiversity loss, and I worked very closely with a former colleague of Susie's, Katie Reid, formerly from the Scottish Children's Parliament, who worked with myself and a number of other colleagues to design and run this children and young people's assembly on biodiversity loss, which is linked to but separate and parallel to the adults Citizens' Assembly. And we just last weekend brought 6 representatives from the Children and Young People's Assembly to the Adults Citizens' Assembly for them to present their calls to action. And so I think that's for me kind of a new innovation, but a really important space and a kind of a new frontier for deliberative democracy and climate assemblies. We have a video capturing what we did in the Children and Young People's Assembly, and I'll put the link to that in the chat in just a minute if anyone wants to watch it back. But I'll leave it there for now, Aline.
Thank you, Dermot Wood. That's a really great insight and advice, particularly also on planning ahead for the intended engagement with the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. Would any other panelists like to come in on this issue of how we can make assemblies more impactful? Tilly, please.
Yeah, I think the climate or citizen assemblies in general are very standardized. They have the strict standards that you have to follow, then you can name it as a citizen or a climate assembly. So in a way, it's the freeware for democracy. Anybody can use it, anybody can initiate it. until the standards are being followed. And there's so much practice and knowledge and kind of analysis, articles, reports, everything out there already. So there's so much to learn from the mistakes also. So to respond maybe to the critique, yeah, that their climate assemblies are delaying climate action, I would respond that, but then let's maybe design them more to kind of give the public mandate to very harsh actions that are needed to be made by the governments or regions or local authorities or globally or European-wise. Or let's prioritize some actions. You know, they can be used in for different purpose in that sense. You know, let's make this purpose more clear, maybe or strict. In Estonia, for example, we don't, Jarme, what you talked about, like that the follow-up of assemblies should be paid more attention. This is what we do from the start, actually. We don't initiate one if we don't know what will happen afterwards. And for me, the assembly format, because it's so standardized, there's so much practice already, there's so much knowledge out there already, also from the lessons learned. They're, in a way, they are like a blueprint for democracy, how it could work. You know, it's knowledge-based, it's very, people come together, they discuss in such a civilized way, although there's like so diverse bunch of people, you know, and then, you know, deliberations, and then the recommendations, and the follow-up should be like, okay, implementation and all that. So it's a blueprint for democracy. So if we use it like that, I think then we can, and we are using it already, so we're not delaying climate action. Thanks.
I think it's really great point. And Susie, next to you.
I think the only thing that I would add to the points that Tina and Dermot made are really just to repeat some of what Dermot said around the time that it takes to have an impact on policy making, and that tension which there often is, and which is particularly felt by Assembly members who learn about a global climate emergency and have a sense of urgency and a sense of ambition, and then are feeding into what often feels to be a very slow process. And I'm not sure that we managed it completely, but one way that you can address this as a policymaker is when you're initiating your assembly is to put in timeframes from the outset. And so one of the things which we said was that the Assembly had to report by a particular timescale, and then the government had to respond back to the Assembly recommendations by a particular timescale. And while that may put pressures both on the process and on some other aspects of it, I think it also gives a framework that everybody knows that they're working to, and kind of helps to manage that expectation around urgency and delivery. And I guess the other thing that I think as organisers of assemblies that we have to do is to help the members to engage kind of more widely in the community, and so that it's not just an internal kind of political process, but it goes out through the communities. And so that's a way to have a more immediate impact, for members to have a more immediate impact, that they have agency and they have the ability to influence things throughout the different levels of government. And to help them to stick with the process over that kind of longer process, that it's not just a 6-week process that they do something, they deliver something and it's finished, but if they want to, that there are ways for them to continue to engage and to stick with that process as it follows through into policy making.
Thank you, Susie. Really important points. And this is particularly upsetting that Guillaume lost his internet connection, because we were really looking forward to hear from him today as a Citizens Assembly participant, and he's a farmer in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Unfortunately, it rains very heavily at the moment where he is, so the internet connection has come completely down. But he's going to record his contribution, which will be posted later on for everyone to listen, because he has a really inspiring story. But I think it's a really important point on how the members of the Citizens Assemblies then engage after the assembly. And we have examples, for example, in France, the participants have established an NGO and continue kind of keeping an eye on the implementation of the recommendations and also lobbying for more ambitious climate action. But I'm sure there are more examples that the panel members would bring. So Claire, you have the floor.
Yeah, briefly, what I think is important to maybe remember is that there's a strong theory of change that if there's a strong mandate coming from a commissioning body, policy change will happen. But I think there's a bit of naivety in believing in that, because change is not linear, and we know that for policy to change, we also need movement and public awareness to support, whatever comes from these assemblies. I think that's something that maybe is not spoken about enough in citizens' assemblies design, is how do you support people to really engage with these processes, and they sometimes tend to be not reaching out to the wider population. And I think that's what we try to do with the Global Assemblies, share this idea that you need wider engagement through popular culture, for instance. So how do you bring the narrative of citizens' deliberation in a way that is really accessible and that people can relate to, and also be really conscious of the power and what's at play here. And we know that, for instance, at COP27 this year, there are more fossil fuel lobbyists than there's ever been, and that's the reality of what we've seen, for instance, with the French process, where we had a really strong mandate from Emmanuel Macron and no filter commitment. So the strongest mandate from you could probably expect, a good enough process with these failings, but good enough, really outstanding recommendations. And despite all of that, the climate and resilience bills that came out of this was quite, a watered down and cherry picked version of the climate, the French Convention's recommendations. And why did that happen? It's, let's acknowledge as well that we operate in political systems, and these processes are embedded in this environment. So I think for me, to have more impact, these citizens' assemblies need to really grapple with power and how politics works and power play, and not be naive about it.
Thank you so much, Claire. Really important point on the importance of power. I see that one of the attendees had a hand raised, Joe Mark, but I don't think we have a capacity to give the floor directly. If you could type your question in the Q&A, and also the other participants, please feel free to type your questions to the panel and we will address them. But for now, I'm going to ask the next question to the panel. Obviously, this event is taking place in a global context, and Claire, you already talked about global assembly and challenges rising due to participants also coming from different political cultures. One question that I always hear is that our citizens' assemblies and kind of the deliberative method that is involved in it, are they only suitable for helping climate policy and democracies, or is there potential for using climate assemblies or learning from climate assemblies and using them in countries which might not yet be considered democracies? So who would like to tackle this one? I know it's not an easy question, but I'm really interested in your views.
Well, I'm obviously not an expert on this, and there are many academics working on, what does deliberation look like in, authoritarian countries. We know there's a lot of deliberation, for instance, happening in China, and we had, with the Global Assembly, we had 18 assembly members from China, for instance, who took part in this process. And I think the way we framed it, with the Global Assembly, we used the concept of governance, and we didn't use the terminology of democracy, for instance, consciously to not exclude, because it doesn't mean citizens from this country can't be part of the deliberation and the discussion. They have a vital role to play. So that was a strategic decision, for instance, to use that and ensure we could have assembly members from countries in current, democratic transition, or we had an assembly member from Myanmar, for instance, which has, been going through a coup back in February, and it was really hard for this assembly member, for instance, to engage in a way that was safe for him, and that raised lots of questions around, assembly participants' welfare in challenging political circumstances, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. I think it needs to be very carefully handled and have the right expertise, and that's something I suppose we're learning. And Professor Nicole Curato is coordinating a team of researchers working on this, for instance. So there will be learning coming from that.
But Alina, I would like to listen to your response actually to your own question. You as a researcher.
Oh, thank you. I agree with what Claire said. I think what the challenging bit about running a deliberative process and the citizens' assembly in an authoritarian country would be ensuring any sort of follow-up from the government, because I think that's where it's going to be very challenging. But nevertheless, I think running citizens' assembly can empower citizens, can help also educate and engage citizens and spur kind of bottom-up action. And we're actually seeing this happening. And even in Europe, one could argue that some governments, at the moment, some governments in power might be less inclined to kind of democratic deliberation. And we're seeing many citizens' assemblies being initiated by NGOs, not by governments, specifically for those reasons as well, where it's hard to get the support from the authorities. And this is precisely the impact they're getting, kind of activating citizens and pushing for more ambitious climate action bottom up. So I agree with Claire, there are considerations on how you run it, but I think there is definitely a potential. Anyone else would like to come in on this? Doesn't look like it. So I had one last question. I think some of you touched on that in your remarks, but we've run a project at CNOCA looking at the attitudes of climate policy actors towards climate assemblies and tried to understand some misconceptions as well. And it was quite interesting for me to find out that a lot of climate experts, and in particular also civil society experts, would see little value in climate assemblies, because they would say, why do we need to engage citizens who are not experts? We are an expert climate community. This is an incredibly complex topic. Surely we have thought of all the solutions possible. We know it all. Why do we need non-experts coming into that? And how can they learn and come up with something useful in just a few days? So I'm just interested, I'm sure all of you have something to say on that, but just very quickly, maybe go around and share kind of your responses to this from your respective assemblies that you've been involved in. Susie, shall I go first to you?
Yeah, happy to do that. I guess I would absolutely disagree that people have all the answers, even if they're experts on climate change or policy making. I think it's such a complex subject, and finding appropriate, effective solutions, I think, requires a whole societal effort. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is I was really struck that one of our academics who supported the Assembly as an expert lead, I think came into the process feeling a little bit sceptical about the system. And his conclusion at the end of the process was that he was absolutely converted to the process, that he was really struck by how quickly ordinary members of society grasp the principles of climate change, and how quickly they learn and absorb really complex facts. But what they bring that the scientists can't do is that breadth of lived experience. So when they're making a recommendation, they're making recommendations which they think will work for people like them, not people that are international academics or heads of state or government, but people like them who have the challenges of their ordinary day lives, and they think that this type of recommendation will address the issue. And I think that is the value that a citizens' assembly brings, because you have lots of different people with lots of different lived experience, and when together they form a consensus around, we think this will work for us in our situation in our country, then that is really powerful and effective.
Thank you, Susie. Tilly.
Yeah, I would continue what Susie just told. So in a climate of citizen assembly, it's like the mini society who makes decisions. And the format proves that if you provide the knowledge, the time, the atmosphere, respectable atmosphere, then ordinary citizens, I don't like the frame at all, but everyday people, they understand the topic. It's possible to make it clear. It's possible to kind of digest it through everybody's own experience and values and the perspective to life. And then that also creates much more ownership around and behind these very difficult decisions that we need to make today and tomorrow, because the topics won't get easier. We're not living in a linear world. More and more complex. We will have more and more crises. So we need to kind of upgrade the way we govern our societies, let's say. And another thing maybe I would bring in is efficiency. The president of Estonia, when he met the young people from the oil shale region, it's not called like that, but it has a name or something region. He was like surprised that, wow, you spent like 4 days virtually together in groups and, as a collective, and you produce this report and these recommendations, more than 25. Like I'm dreaming of a state that would work that efficiently. So building on that, it's like, yeah, it is actually a very efficient format. It just demands, a lot of planning. It demands budget. It demands expertise and all the, following the standards. But at the same time, do we know the cost of bad citizen engagement? Like we often don't know, like the processes that have failed, that have not created more public trust and some like real impact. So in that sense, it is an efficient way to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Tilly. That reminds me of a great quote of one of the assembly facilitators I recently interviewed. She said, the biggest learning from the citizens' assemblies for her was how greatly we underestimate the ability of people. But we have a few questions from the audience, so I'd like to pose them, and feel free, panel members, to indicate which one you'd like to go for. So one very important one: how can we utilize climate assemblies to go beyond and contribute to the improvement of climate literacy among less educated and marginalized groups of the public? Who would like to go for this one? So how can climate assembly help? Yeah, Susie, please.
I think what we tried to do in Scotland was try to produce some quite engaging materials. Now, I mean, it's in a Scottish context, and so we tried to produce videos which are actually still available on YouTube. If you Google it, you can see the videos that we produced. And the idea was to try to make it as accessible as possible. And then once the assembly had finished, we produced an animation, so a little cartoon with one of the older assembly members and one of the children that had been involved through the Children's Parliament having a dialogue and explaining what the process had been and what the outcomes had been. And the purpose of that really was to try to explain to people not just about the assembly, but about some of the recommendations that came out of it. But I think this idea of climate literacy was very much a theme that our members were feeling really passionately about and really keen to have a much wider understanding throughout public in Scotland about climate change.
Thank you, Susan. Dermot.
Yeah, thanks, Selena. And I can, in this context, speak from the experience of the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss that's ongoing, both in the Children and Young People's Assembly that we ran and the Adult Citizens' Assembly, some of which I've been attending as an observer. The theme of education and awareness is coming through really strongly. It I guess didn't surprise me so much that came up in the Children and Young People's deliberations, because that's the world they live, but it's also coming through as a really strong theme in the deliberations of the Adults Citizens' Assembly, the need for education, for more information on biodiversity and biodiversity loss here in Ireland. And so building on or echoing what Susie said, we have, because we were working with children and young people from the start, we tried to make the activities, the resources that we designed for the children and young people as fun and accessible as possible. But we're also planning, we're waiting to hear on a funding application to enable us to build on all of the materials and resources that we designed and develop them into educational resources that can be used in schools and communities and elsewhere. So seeing that as a kind of a legacy piece that it's the impact of the assembly isn't just what happens in the room, but that you build forward from the activities and all the work that goes into the assembly.
Thank you, Dermot. I hope you will be successful in your efforts. Claire.
Yeah, building on what Dermot was saying, really, it's what we did with the Global Assemblies. We had community assemblies that people could initiate and run in parallel with the co-assembly. So the co-assembly was the sortition selected group of 100, but in the end, and that was, you could say only 1,300 people took part, but that was an interesting example of how you can actually support people to really engage with the assembly materials and contextualize it to what's relevant for them in their local community. So they had access to the same resources as the co-assembly, and they hold their community assemblies to discuss, what was coming up for them in their communities. And there was a wiki that was available, and people translated into their own language using the resources and examples from their community. So I think that's another way of saying, how do you bring the conversations beyond the walls of this assembly, which in a way are, they are just a lucky few can be selected. And it's looking at what the some of the academic crowd calls the deliberative system. How can we embed deliberation much more widely into our society? And that's, for me, that's one of the thing I'm really interested in going forward, because I'm wondering how are we going to deal with polarization in our communities when the crisis potentially unfolds more, and adaptation is becoming a topic that we need to address much more at our local level. So I think that's potentially a tool as well to bear in mind when we design assemblies, I suppose.
Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing these experiences on how actually citizens' assemblies and materials generated as part of the assembly, and also people engaged, could actually go much beyond the participants and help engage broader society. I think really valuable examples there. We have very little time left, but can perhaps, would someone like to very quickly tackle the question, what are the shortfalls, this comes from the audience, what are the shortfalls of the current climate assemblies taking place, and what do you suggest to have more effective and inclusive assemblies? Who would like to go at this one very briefly? Well, Susie, I think you already gave some advice to policymakers. I don't know if you want to say anything specific in terms of shortfalls and in this context.
I think for me, the biggest challenge is that following through process and making sure that, and I think others have spoken about this as well, that, and Chile particularly, from the outset, that it's clear to everybody involved, whether it's a member or a speaker or a policymaker, how the assembly recommendations are going to feed through into the policymaking process. And that may take a short time or a long time, but to have a way of assessing that, and then a way of keeping members engaged with the process. So I guess that's a shortfall, is that we don't think about it enough, and it's challenging and difficult, but really, really important.
Thank you so much, Susie. Very important point. Chile, 1 minute.
Yeah, it's a huge question, but maybe like, what's the end goal or strategy of organizing these assemblies? That to think through that. For example, in Estonia, we are just beginners, but we dream of institutionalized formats like that already at the parliament level, maybe on the Baltic states level, maybe on the European level. This is what we're kind of working towards too. And if you keep that maybe in mind, then it's easier to connect these like one-off events also. Thanks.
Dermot, I'm so sorry. The organizers are telling me we have to finalize this, but I'd love to thank all of the panel today and the audience for great questions. And just to leave you with 3 key messages. I think the panel was very clear today that the political decisions and legal frameworks alone won't solve the climate crisis unless the whole of the broader society joins in and helps build this lasting mandate for ambitious climate action. And climate assemblies are an important tool for healthy democracies and for citizen participation, but they're not a fix-all solution. And it's important that we learn from the experiences as we did today, and we do assemblies right to make them more impactful and more effective. And if you are thinking about organizing citizens' assemblies, please do come to Knocker, look at our website and engage with us. We have these fantastic experts who are with us today. Thank you for your time and for continuing sharing your expertise. Thank you, and have a lovely day.